I'm Lucy.
And I'm Jennifer.
You're listening to Everything I Know About.
Each week, we share everything we know about a new topic, equipped with some internet research and a little too much exposure to pop culture. Hey, everyone.
Hi, everybody. Today, we are chatting about true crime. I'm a big true crime fan. What's your relationship with true crime, Jennifer?
Pretty mild, I think, compared to some other people, but I loved the Serial podcast. The majority of my podcast listening up until a few years ago was 100% true crime podcasts.
Okay.
I was really into Rotten Mango. I listened to almost every single episode of that. Yeah, and I was never really into the documentary stuff. I like true crime that's more social angled, like the Tinder swindler and stuff like that, rather than
the
horrific murders.
Yeah, the murders, the serial killers. Okay.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you primarily get your true crime media through podcasts.
As stereotypical as it is, yes. Yes, I do.
Okay, yeah. I feel like for most people, Serial inducted them into the true crime world. It's such a huge industry, and today I wanted to do an episode on true crime, talk a little bit about its history, really try to understand why it's so popular, and then just have a broader discussion about some of the issues and complications of watching and being a fan of true crime. So I think there's actually a lot to dig into here.
Yeah. I was really surprised with how much there was to dig into once I started doing research. I was focused primarily on why we like it so much, but then I was getting down all these rabbit holes of celebrity criminals that come out of these true crime podcasts. So very, very meaty topic.
Yeah. So let's start with a brief history, and I think we'll set the stage for some of these broader discussions about modern day. So actually, true crime has been around for a long time. In Germany, which was the epicenter of early printing, we're talking mid-16th century, there were these cheap pamphlets called broadsheets, which were regularly printed, and they were focused on recounting crimes and the executions of criminals.
Wow.
Yeah. At that time, reporting these grisly stories was commercial, but also largely moral. It was heavily influenced by the church and religious right and wrong. The stories were focused on reporting a moral wrong that then that person was punished. And the shock value of the crimes and sensationalism was a sign that God was trying to get people's attention, kind of as a warning sign, you should not be doing these things. Virtually all of the accounts during the 16th century came with some sort of edifying Christian message, and they were more focused on emotional retellings of the victims' stories, creating sympathy. This starts to change in the 1600s in England, where first-person retellings from the criminal's perspective start to emerge. And there's more and more a focus on the criminal. So an example...
Wait, so they would interview these people?
Yeah. So an example is this English prison chaplain named Henry Goodcole. He was regularly going into these prisons as his day job, and then he began to interview inmates about why they committed the crimes. And these proved to be very popular broadsheets, often featuring very hyperbolic confessions and stories. He was one of the most eminent true crime authors of that time. As we start to move into the 17th century, we start to deviate away from the religious assumption that human depravity is just original sin and therefore requires no unique explanation. While medieval justice had focused more on restitution for harm done, the early modern state in the 17th century was more concerned with the act of actually violating the law. And that's where criminal intent really starts to play a role, because now you're trying to convince a jury. And it's less focused on moral right and wrong, but more what was the mindset? Was it self-defense? Were there potential justifications? And we become more interested in really dissecting the mind and motivations of the criminal.
So it becomes more nuanced, essentially. Before it was just oh, you killed somebody, this is your sentence.
Exactly.
And now it's why?
Yeah, exactly. It's focused on why, but true crime of the time. It was not actually very focused on truth. These were incredibly sensationalized accounts, a big focus on blood and gore. There was even this way of illustrating at the time called woodcuts that would literally depict the most gruesome aspects of a crime, like dismemberment, and those would be featured in these pamphlets because that's what's sold.
I'm just imagining Joseph down at the thatched roofed inn, getting a mead with his bros, being hey, what happened down there? What was the crime? Tell me about it. That's the journalism of the time. It's just, the peasants gathering.
Totally. And this is the era of public hangings. That practice didn't stop until the mid-1800s. So it was an event that you could go to and watch for fun. And somewhat maybe the argument was this is kind of a warning against bad behavior, but also the reality is people enjoyed it. huge crowds would turn out to watch capital punishments that were happening in public. And by the 1800s, we see serial killers becoming celebrities, becoming household names. There's even a record of this major serial killer at the time, James Greenacre. And at his hanging, pies and portrait illustrations were sold in his honor.
In his honor?
Yeah. People were
What?
fans. They were like, oh yeah, I want a portrait.
That is wild.
Yeah.
That's interesting, though, because that coincides with that period in England that was really interested in seances and ghosts. So I wonder if that has any linkage.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the early day publications, yes, they would be talking about criminal acts, but as I said, they were not very focused on the facts. They would include things like witchcraft or these kind of other dark, evil tropes that they would add into their coverage.
Yeah. Seems like a period of time where people were really interested in the gritty underbelly.
Yeah. So in 1829, you have the first centrally organized police force, which is London's Metropolitan Police. And we also see this coincide with the rise of detective and true crime novels. There's Edgar Allan Poe's Auguste Dupin, which forms the inspiration for Sherlock Holmes, created by Arthur Conan Doyle. And eventually, in the early 1900s, Agatha Christie, who I personally am a huge fan of. I love her Miss Marple series. You start to see the emergence of this classic archetype, the whodunit, with a good, worthy detective catching the criminal. And that is the root of a lot of modern day crime fiction, true crime media, where the watcher, the viewer, gets to live in that role of detective, especially for unsolved cases that are reported on, which I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about that.
Oh, yeah.
And to fast forward into modern day, because I think we have this period essentially before Serial where we've moved past the okay, people are just fundamentally bad, so it's no surprise that they commit crimes. We've gotten into, okay, there's maybe some more nuance in terms of why people commit crimes, and we're starting to even develop empathy or sympathy for the criminal if we can truly understand their psyche. Then we've kind of gotten into detective fiction, understanding what the system can do to fight crime. Detectives are great, police forces are great. They can help us make our society more safe. Then you have Serial, which is a total game changer. The first season comes out in 2014 and changes true crime because it focuses on the issues with the actual system. And I've got this quote here that said, "It did so by confronting listeners over and over again to the infinite cruelty behind a possibly wrongful conviction and the apparent shakiness of the evidence used to secure it. Serial was never openly militant, but it cemented the idea that there was a way to make something noble out of a true crime story."
Ooh.
Yeah, that's a very pro take. Obviously, Serial is quite controversial, but it was an example of a story that didn't claim to know the truth. And yet it was set up in this format of very prestige audio broadcasting, right? It was literally created by This American Life. And so you had this reporter who, she's a journalist, she's purporting to tell the truth, but she's also complicating the truth by admitting multiple times throughout the course of the season that she doesn't know who to believe. She doesn't know if the main character, it's so even weird to refer to him as a character because he's a person. The convict in this case. Adnan,
right?
Yes, Adnan Syed. She doesn't know if he's innocent or guilty. And multiple times through the show, you can hear her struggling with his memories. And I think even in episode 1, she goes into this section where she just talks about the fallibility of memory in general. And that's not really true crime reporting, right? We're starting to move into this other, I don't know, it's almost like you get the media now as a character in the story. She is also a character. It's primarily him, Adnan, and then her, and their interactions are what's being recorded.
Yeah, it feels like it definitely made it turn more into a human interest or psychology story rather than just purely crime. Because you're right, she is almost trying to get into the head of Adnan and being like, what was he thinking? What were the dynamics? We get really into his relationship with his girlfriend, who was the victim in the case. And it really does feel like more of a human interest story. I actually knew somebody who worked on Serial.
Oh.
Who did the editing.
Wait, that's
for
crazy.
Serial. Yeah. Apparently, Sarah Koenig, who is the host of Serial, they had to cut a lot of stuff out of the raw footage. Obviously, there was hours and hours, so this is nothing new. But she was getting kind of flirty with Adnan, apparently. They were kind of developing a bit of an emotional connection and she was having, it sounded like an emotional interest. So they had a hard time editing out all of that bias into the final cut of the podcast. So his take was she was giving him a lot of slack and her bias really was introduced in the podcast because he was really charming apparently when they were talking.
Wow.
So I don't know, take that as you will.
Wow, that's like a whole other world.
Right.
The stories of women who fall in love with killers and like really develop an obsession around that. We'll get into it.
Yeah.
Damn, that's, yeah. When you're presented a story in a way that's very sympathetic to the criminal, I mean, we're all kind of led to whatever the angle of the story wants us to believe, right?
Totally.
Creepy. Yeah. Ugh. Okay. Let me just wrap up the Serial stuff. So Serial became the first ever podcast to win a Peabody Award, and it inspired, obviously, so many podcasts in a very similar format since then. There's even a parody of it in Only Murders in the Building. I don't know if you've seen that show on Hulu.
I haven't. I didn't know there was a parody of it.
They literally have a character called Cinda Canning.
Oh, God.
And she speaks in the, the classic Serial voice, and they play the Serial music. So,
Wow.
yeah. It's very much like in our popular culture now. But around this time when Serial was popular, because Serial was released in 2014, there was actually this other show called The Jinx in 2015. Have you seen this?
No.
Oh my God. All right. This is my favorite true crime documentary. People can probably tell I'm like literally fangirling over this shit, which is like so problematic. But like, no, I highly, highly recommend watching The Jinx. The full name is The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst. It's very similar style to Serial, where it's a team of reporters who are telling his life story, and he's still alive, and he's actually interviewed in the series. And it's like a 4-part HBO prestige drama type thing, where literally the ending is mind-blowing. Anyway, that's all I'll say. But you've got that show, you've got Netflix's prestige drama, Making a Murderer. So this era sparks this true crime boom that we're still in today. A big hit recently was Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story. It's a fictionalized account of the serial killer's life, and it actually became Netflix's second most watched show in the first 4 weeks of its release, second only to Stranger Things, beating Bridgerton, which I feel like some people who aren't in the world of true crime might be surprised by. But no, true crime really draws everybody. Why is it so popular? Who is watching all this media on true crime other than me, clearly?
Well, I was going to say, this is a perfect segue into some stats that I found. So yeah, true crime is huge. It's way bigger than I thought it was. There was a study in 2019 that showed that 50% of Americans enjoy true crime content, 35% of Americans consume it weekly, and 76% consider themselves fans.
Damn, that doesn't
It's
surprise
basically
me.
everybody.
Yeah.
Basically everybody. So that's interesting. But the more interesting question is, why is this so universally enjoyed? Some self-reported reasons were that it makes the viewer feel more empathetic. They say it helps them understand the legal system better, which I thought was a really interesting one. I feel like that is true. A lot of the knowledge I have about the legal system is 100% from true crime. And they feel it makes them more informed about the world. I'm like, oh, is this like a source of news for people?
Yeah.
In a way.
I mean, these feel like when you self-rationalize your interest a bit too much, though, you know?
Yeah, no, 100%. So to get away from what people say that they get out of it, there's a professor from the University of Oregon. She's a professor of journalism named Whitney Phillips, and she has this class on digital platforms and ethics, specifically around true crime, which I thought was really interesting. So I was looking at some of her materials. She does a lot of stuff on like internet trolling, malicious online activity, and the ethical implications of true crime and culture subjects, which I'm like, dang, if I were in college, I would have loved to take a class like that. That's so cool. Anyway, she says that there's 3 main components that make true crime so universally enjoyable. One of them is that viewers enjoy the mystery element. So it's very akin to the mystery novel, which has always been popular, which you touched on. And the true nature of true crime makes people feel more invested and like they're actually part of the story. And the second part of this, which is akin to the first point, is people enjoy watching a case getting solved from the comfort of their couch. Another article that I read made the point that oftentimes the true crime media is told as a story, almost like a fictionalized story in the structure, where you don't understand the motive or you may not even know who the killer is until the end of the story.
Yeah.
So it's told as a novel. And then the third one, which is, this opens up a can of worms, but this is interesting. The third reason it's so popular is white women are the largest demographic of true crime watchers. And women have anxiety about potential threats, potential outside danger. So they turn to true crime to feel better prepared for something violent.
What?
Yeah.
I'm surprised that would make you feel better. I feel like if you're afraid of it, it might make you more afraid, knowing the details of all the ways a crime could happen to you.
Yeah. Apparently, this is actually comforting. This is backed up by multiple studies and articles that I've read that people find it comforting because they feel more informed and like they would know what to do. It's almost like an exposure therapy thing.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I guess I have seen even on social media those cameras inside of Airbnbs, which is so creepy when you see those videos and it's women. I don't know if these are staged or real, but they like uncover a hidden camera inside of the shower.
Yeah.
But then I'm like, oh, now I know at least to check. And it creates this weird false sense of security, even though obviously the main issue
Oh,
is that there's a fucking camera there to begin
yeah.
with, you know?
Yeah. The sentiment is that danger exists anyway, and you're just ignorant to it if you're not consuming this kind of
Yeah.
media. But if you surround yourself with true crime, I think you start to have a skewed perception of how much crime is actually happening and like how much danger you're in walking down the street.
Yeah, I mean, I saw this study. It was about reports of crime in news sources. And if you read more news stories about crime, you're more likely to think there's more crime in your neighborhood, which makes
Yeah.
sense, right? It's not
100%.
actually based on statistics, it's just based on your perception.
Yeah, totally. I was reading an article from a journalist of 16 years who got out of the game because he was really exacerbated with the way that true crime is being reported. And his point was that news organizations cover crime in the sensationalist way because it drives ratings, of course. But journalists want to be more objective and they want to be careful in how they cover crime, but they're pushed so hard by the networks to get these good ratings. And he felt ethically like he couldn't do it anymore after 16 years. So,
Yeah, the relationship between true crime and the media is so fraught. Like, I'm thinking about how there's lots of copycats when it comes to committing crimes. Somebody reads something in the news and then it inspires them to go do the same act. Or there have been serial killers with very strange relationships to the media, like the Zodiac killer sent multiple letters to the SF Chronicle threatening that if they didn't publish them, he would commit acts of mass murder and terrorism. So yeah, clearly true crime reporting plays a role in giving these serial killers the platform that they want. And a lot of the time, serial killers are known to be very obsessed with earning credit for their killings, and you even have cases of murderers after they've been arrested claiming credit for killings that had not yet been discovered or making false confessions to try to get more credit. It's really messed up.
very interesting.
And then also to your point about women being more affected, for serial killers in particular, 70% of their victims are women, whereas for homicide in general, women are only 22% of homicide victims. So serial killers literally target women.
Yeah, totally. And most true crime stories feature female victims. It does fit in nicely with this evolutionary idea that people are instinctively drawn to stories where they can identify with the victim and with the tragedy. So it's kind of this self-fulfilling prophecy where it's like, okay, white women are more likely to watch true crime, so they feature more stories where white women are the victims, and then the cycle goes on and on. On a more universal scale, though, both men and women are drawn to true crime because we need something that creates an element of excitement. And we all feel this desire to solve a puzzle, but to do so from the safety of our couches. So this mix gives us a short, sharp shot of adrenaline that we become addicted to.
Fascinating. I was like, oh, maybe people are just obsessed with the macabre, even like the history of it being a lot of public interest in these hangings and seeing, I guess, the suffering of other people. It's not yourself, right? There's some like creepy desire to like peer in. I feel like there's a similarity between people's interest in true crime and voyeurism, or even, I mean, this is adjacent, but I would say like celebrity courtroom dramas, right? Where you were just enjoying the suffering, like with Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, I'm thinking of. But so many people watch that just because they wanted to hate on Amber. And like, they got pleasure out of seeing her suffer or pretend to suffer, depending on what you believe.
But I do feel like there is such a stark difference between those sort of true crime stories and the violent true crime of Serial or My Favorite Murder. The Amber Heard story feels more of like tapping into that reality TV interest that women have, because we love analyzing people. And it's like this sociological, anthropological interest that feels very innate. And I'm thinking even of Gwyneth Paltrow's trial. So you get the mix of, oh, did she do it? Did she not do it? There's the mystery, but then there's also the whole backstory of the celebrity. And yeah, part of it is the courtroom drama. Like we love to see the legal system play out. And that's actually one of the points that these articles were making, where it is a confirmation bias one way or the other. Like if you believe in the justice system, watching and consuming true crime media where the killer is brought to justice reaffirms your belief in the system. Whereas these cases where somebody gets off or they never find the killer, it reaffirms your bias that, yeah, the justice system doesn't work. So people tend to like gravitate towards one kind or another.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, that effect on how we think about the justice system reminds me of the CSI effect, which is this theory that shows like CSI, Law and Order, they actually affect people's thinking when it comes time for them to serve on juries for criminal trials. they have a very high standard of forensic evidence that they're expecting to be presented to them.
Oh, like they expect it to be like ironclad?
Well, they expect it to be like TV, where there's dusting for fingerprints for everything and all of this actual physical evidence that often the reality of most criminal cases is there's often not the budget or that evidence doesn't actually exist. But because we've consumed these shows, we believe that, oh, if that doesn't exist, then the prosecutors aren't doing their job.
Wow, that is fascinating.
Yeah. It's kind of debated whether this is a true effect since we don't have a lot of empirical studies backing it up. As you might imagine, it's challenging to study this in a real world environment. But the fact that people believe the effect exists changes things around the trial anyway. Like this judge said that regardless of if the CSI effect impacts actual verdicts, he's seen teams perform scientific tests and present evidence to the jury that they would not have, just so that they have results to show them, even if the results have no impact on an innocent or guilty verdict, just to show the jury that they did it.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
I can so see that too, though. Like you've watched Law and Order a bunch of times and you're like, well, why didn't you dust the steering wheel? Like,
Exactly.
How do you know he drove?
But anyway, back to your first point around what is considered true crime. There is a difference between violent and nonviolent crime, but in terms of how it's portrayed, I do think the lines are getting so blurred because the narrative structures used are so similar. To the point you made earlier, what draws us in is this storytelling, almost fiction-like element, where the accused is a main character. And, I mean, their gender plays a role in how they're portrayed. But frankly, across many, many different crime genres, we're using similar storytelling devices. Like, obviously, there's serial killer, violent crimes we would normally think of, but there's also this subgenre of thieves. I'm pretty into this genre, actually, where it's like
thievery genre.
Yeah, like jewel thieves. Dude, I find jewel thieves so fascinating. Yeah.
Wait. Okay, this is ringing a bell now because at first I was like, what the hell are you talking about? But there's all of these international art thieves, right?
Art
like I think
thieves,
there's some
thieves,
like
yes, because it's totally different from violent crime, but there's still the mystery. There's still the like what leads someone down this path to like want to do this as their profession, and then also the how do they get away with it? That's really interesting.
Totally.
There's the whole cult leaders. Like there's a ton of those now on Netflix, right?
Yeah.
There's the white-collar fraud, Theranos, Anna Delvey.
Yeah, totally. The Theranos case or Anna Delvey, Gypsy Rose Blanchard. These are the female, I was going to say protagonist too, but that's terrible.
So weird,
Like,
right?
They're like the criminal. They have these stories told about them. And the male crimes that we see are like Ted Bundy, horrible, horrific serial killers. But then you get Anna Delvey on the female side. So you had made a point, like, do we treat male criminals and female criminals differently in media? I looked into this and I thought about it a lot too. Is it that women are less violent than men? So we get these more sort of reality TV type human interest stories when it's a woman committing the crime, but then like the male stories are just so much more violent. So I looked into that. And what's really interesting, can you guess what percentage of total murders are committed by women? If you just had to guess.
I would say 20%.
10.
Oh, damn.
Yeah. 10% of total murders are committed by women. And then 17% of serial murders are committed by women.
Oh, okay. I think I was thinking serial killers. Yeah.
Okay, of course you knew that stat. But I was like, okay, who are they? What was their stories? What was their vibe? So I tried to look up these lists of worst female murderers, criminals. Okay, half of these lists either are like those stupid BuzzFeed ones where you have to click through it at the slideshow. Like there's no real articles on this. It was so hard to find.
Yeah.
And then they were named things like dark beauties, femme fatale murderers in history, and just like kind of this jokey tone. So I was like, God, this like really is what we're talking about. It's a sensationalization of this crime. And interestingly enough, half of the women on these lists were like Mary the First of England, like Bloody Mary, who killed all these Protestants. And it was women in history, like from way back when. Or they were the partners to serial killers, like they were a duo, like the Bonnie and Clyde duo, or there were a few others where it was like really, they were out there doing heists and murders with a man. Very few like lone serial killers. One of them was a sex worker who murdered 10 people in the 1960s, but she claimed self-defense on all of it. I was like, you know what? I bet at least one of them was self-defense.
Yeah,
like,
that's real.
I kind of believe her. At least one. She got fed up. So again, there is this bias of the audience, yes, being women, particularly white women, that influences, but also a lot of these really horrific crimes that, as horrible as it is to say, would make good sensationalized media are just men committing crimes against women.
There's so many men.
Yeah.
And they're usually white men.
So many men.
Yeah.
Totally. And even like the female killers in general, not even serial killers, it is self-defense. Like one of them is Lorena Bobbitt. Do you remember this case in the 90s?
No.
She cut off her abusive husband's member.
Oh, I do know this.
Yeah.
Of course I know it.
But she's considered one of like the most violent female criminals.
Oh my God.
Like,
no, she was suffering abuse.
Yeah, she was being abused. Gypsy Rose Blanchard, another case, suffering abuse.
Right. But then Gypsy Rose didn't even kill her mother. She had her boyfriend kill her mother. So
yeah, she just organized her.
Yeah.
Not that that's much better, but
I feel like the true crime coverage women do get when they're the criminal is women committing sexual crimes. Like I'm thinking the female teacher and the underage boy student.
Oh, yeah.
There's been so many stories like that. Most recently, this movie May December came out. Have you seen that?
Just assume I haven't seen anything because I'm saying no to everything at this point.
Oh God, I really recommend it. It was up for a lot of awards this past season, but quick trigger warning for victims of child sexual abuse and sexual assault because that is the crime that this movie is based on. So May December is based on the real life story of Mary Kay Letourneau, who at age 34 sexually abused and raped her 12-year-old student, Vili Fulau. She did get caught and go to jail, but she had his child and they got married after she got out of prison. So they claimed they were in love and had a life together. Eventually, they did get divorced and she died from cancer, but Vili is still alive and has kind of reevaluated his life experience to realize that he was a victim. In the movie, which is loosely based on this, Julianne Moore plays Gracie, who is the older woman who fell in love and had sex with Joe, a 13-year-old who works at a pet store with her. And the movie takes place many years after this when they're married and she's in her 50s and he's around 30. And in the world of the movie, there is a movie being made about their story. So this actress who Natalie Portman plays comes to town and she is playing Gracie in the movie. So it's super meta. It's a true crime movie where inside of the movie, someone is making a true crime movie. And because of this framing device, Natalie Portman's character becomes a proxy for the audience. And it enables the movie to then make direct commentary about us, the viewers, through how it treats her character. So I think the movie is actually a great vehicle to guide our conversation around the problems with true crime. And I feel like typically the criticism of true crime falls in two buckets. The first is how we sensationalize crimes to make money and for entertainment without really considering who is harmed or who that money even goes to. And then two, a lot of true crime media centers the criminal rather than the victim. And we develop this desire to understand the criminal as if we're solving some sort of puzzle rather than really recognizing that there were victims that were actually harmed.
Yeah.
And so on the first point, I was very curious to understand how the profit flows. Like, obviously, we know it's a huge genre. Lots of eyeballs means someone is making money. And I had heard that in Anna Delvey's case, while she was in jail, she was actually paid $390,000 by Netflix for the rights to her story. So, yeah.
She should get millions. Justice for Anna.
So I looked into how does the money flow and how does it typically work? And it turns out that because a lot of true crime is ripped from the headlines, the names and events quoted are public information. So there's no requirement to actually pay the people involved for the story. And that means that the victims often don't receive any kind of compensation, nor is their consent even required. And that's definitely part of the ick factor. To use May December as an example, Vili was not consulted in the making of the movie, nor did he get any compensation, and he spoke out criticizing it. But I found this amazing tweet, quote, "Interesting combo going on re-May December. The inherently exploitive nature of art based on real people. The responsibility of artists to consult subjects that inspire their work. For some compelling thoughts on this, might I recommend seeking out Todd Haynes' new film, May December." I think the art recognizes all of the complexity of the issue. It's literally what the movie is about. And yet, in real life, that's like also happening, right? And so it's this very complicated thing. I don't know. Just because May December is aware of the issue, does it make it right that they went ahead anyway?
Yeah, like I heard there was a huge issue when the Ted Bundy documentary came out because a lot of the victims didn't want Netflix to release that. I think they even signed a petition to try to like get Netflix to not release it, and they did anyway. So yeah, you just completely lose any control over something that's like so personal and traumatizing for you.
Yeah. Sometimes people argue that, well, the benefit of true crime is it helps the people currently suffering because the victim is trying to bring a killer to justice. So maybe it's a current case or something, or like the situation of a nun, right? Trying to get him out of jail. But the issue with a lot of this true crime stuff is often they're investigating cases within the last 50 years, but they're not in the most recent news because you have more access to court records if the case is not immediately happening. And so then is there really any benefit? It's part of what we grapple with as viewers, right?
Sadly. I wish there was a way that we could get like the interest and the intrigue and the mystery out of it without it being harmful to the victims. Because I can only imagine like if somebody that I loved was affected and their story was used for entertainment value, like I would absolutely not be okay with that. But then at the same time, it's like you can't help but consume it either.
Yeah, I saw this quote from Amanda Knox. Do you know Amanda Knox?
Oh, yeah. I did watch her true crime documentary.
Yeah. She is interesting because she was accused of murdering her roommate in Italy, and she was acquitted, so it was a wrongful conviction. So in that sense, she's a victim of the system. But she was also the accused and played the role of criminal in a lot of the coverage about her. So I think she's actually a great segue into the second bucket of criticism around true crime, which is that we're more interested in the criminal than the victim, and we treat it as a fun puzzle to solve. I saw this quote from her that said, "I never wanted to be at the center of a sensational true crime story. Nobody does. But once I was thrust into the public eye, there was no going back. One moment, I was living my life as an anonymous student. Without warning, every action was under a microscope. Even after my acquittal, no part of my life was safe from scrutiny and judgment." And so actually that quote speaks to both the victim experience we were just talking about, but also the experience of the criminal. And May December also speaks to this because Natalie Portman's character throughout the entire movie, she's doing research on the character of Gracie, and under the guise of doing research for her role, she gets to dig into Gracie's life and really try to understand her psyche. And she goes to a lot of family events. She interviews people in their lives, even when it makes Gracie uncomfortable. She's kind of collecting gossip. And I feel like it's a very similar mentality to us as the viewers when we get sucked into these true crime stories.
Yeah, like people are like inserting themselves in these cases that they're watching. I feel like you've really seen this a lot more on Reddit and TikTok, where one case in particular that I'm thinking of, it was in 2021. Do you remember the Gabby Petito case?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah.
That was insane.
It was insane. So like just a refresher, in 2021, Gabby Petito, who was 22 years old, and she was missing. She was on a road trip, I guess, with her boyfriend, Brian Laundrie at the time. And her body was found in Wyoming. And Brian fled from Wyoming to his parents' house in Florida. And he was later found with a self-inflicted gunshot wound, killed 2 months after her body was found. And he admitted to killing her in his notebook. And in those 2 months when they didn't know where Gabby was, they hadn't found her body yet, Brian was the main suspect. TikTok was flooded with people looking at Gabby and Brian's social medias, like coming up with theories. People were getting so involved, digging through the internet, trying to find info on either of them. And there's a lot of discussion about like, oh, we just care about this because it's a 22-year-old white girl. Like how many Indigenous Black women are missing? Like, why do we care about this one? That was like a huge discussion. But I think the most interesting angle for me was how like kind of parasocial and involved people got with it. Even on Reddit, you see people like trying to solve cold cases, and like there's entire communities of people who do this as a hobby.
Yeah, well, I feel like it's one thing to be like, oh, parasocial relationship with the detective or the victim, like trying to help solve a case. But then you have this whole world of parasocial with the killer and like falling in love with serial killers.
I know it's for sure a thing.
I don't know how prevalent it truly is. It's unclear if this is actually a minority thing, but it just gets a lot of press because it's so hard for so many people to grasp. But
yeah,
in particular, like Ted Bundy, there was a lot of media about a large number of women who were attracted to him after his arrest, and they would show up at his trial, jam the courtrooms, and he got hundreds of love letters from women when he was in prison. So actually there's a scientific name for this desire, which is called hybristophilia, when you're sexually interested in those who commit crimes.
This has a term?
Yeah.
What?
The cause is unclear, right? Like people speculate, and like some people even self-identify that it might be because of low self-esteem or lack of a father figure. Some believe they can change a man. Some see the little boy inside the serial killer and they just need to like nurture them.
Biggest eye roll ever.
And then this one I thought was really interesting, which is the idea of a perfect boyfriend, because you know where he is at all times. He's in jail. And yeah. And you could claim that someone loves you, but you don't have to deal with the day-to-day issues and stress of a real relationship.
Oh my God. This sounds like weirdly adjacent to the sister wives argument where like, yeah, I get my protection. I technically have a man, but I don't have to deal with him.
Yeah.
Share the burden.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Oh my God. I'm sorry. That's kind of funny. That's very funny, actually.
Yeah, but it's the elevation of being a fan to the utmost, right? Like, people are in love with K-pop idols. People are in love with serial killers. So I don't know. But on a more serious note, obviously falling in love with a serial killer is the extreme, but I do think for a lot of fans of true crime, myself included, part of the fascination is getting inside the criminal mind and trying to understand the motivations behind what led them down this dark path. And May December speaks to this as well. Through the process of Natalie Portman's character learning about Gracie and uncovering her secrets, you as the viewer get the payoff feeling that you see her having on screen, which is these moments of delight as she feels like she's unlocking and understanding more and more of why Gracie is the way she is. There's this really powerful scene, and a little spoiler alert, because I'm going to describe a scene that happens later in the movie. So just skip the next 10 seconds if you are planning on watching the movie on your own. One of the things that comes out from Gracie's son from a previous marriage is he tells her that Gracie had written in her diary that she was sexually abused by her older brothers. And when that information is revealed, you can see Natalie Portman's character, her eyes get big, and it's as if she had this epiphany, finally understanding why Gracie is the way she is. You can see Natalie gets a lot of comfort out of finally finding a reason for her fucked up behavior. But then at the end of the movie, spoiler alert, Gracie literally looks into Natalie Portman's eyes, which is by default looking into the viewer's eyes, and she says, "No, that never happened. That was made up. He lied to you." And has this creepy smile. And then for me, I was like, oh my God, I really was excusing her behavior because of the abuse I thought happened to her. And it's unclear whether truly no abuse happened or if this is a cover, because Gracie doesn't want the actress to know. But should it matter? Like, why am I feeling empathy when there's a reason behind the crime? When either way, the victim's life is still ruined. It doesn't change anything for him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's crazy. That's actually a really genius way to make that point,
It
too.
was so genius. So I guess after dipping your toes in the water, because you're not as much into this world as I am, what are your thoughts? Are you going to be more a consumer of true crime media, or do you buy into some of the critiques of it and are maybe a little skeptical?
I feel like I've gotten my fill of it, honestly. I'm not like as interested as you used to be. I'm more interested in like the Gypsy Rose Blanchard kind of like white collar crime than I am in violent crime. Like that is very fascinating to me.
It's interesting that you consider her white collar crime when she murdered her mother.
Okay, you're right. Let me back that one up. Morally ambiguous crime.
Okay. All right. I mean, you should watch the Jinx and then we'll see if it can change your mind, because I will. That was like some real amazing reporting.
I would love to watch it. Did this change your mind at all about how you consume true crime?
I think I always...
The silence is a no.
I always knew there were issues, but I think like that's why I was such a fan of May December, because that movie, it recognizes all of the problems with true crime and yet it still exists. So by nature, they were like okay with that, right? I think it helps to be more aware of the issues. But yeah, I think if you're a fan like I am and like watching these things, I think you are complicit.
From everything that we've seen, though, it's a very human thing. It's not like, oh, there's something particularly perverse about like your mind or somebody who's into true crime. It's just this human thing. We want to solve the mystery. We're interested, especially being a woman, in psychology, anthropology, and seeing ourselves in the victim. It hits you. You're like, God, like these women, I want to know their stories. I want to know what's happening. So I think it's kind of natural, but yeah, problematic for sure.
I mean, yeah, I do think it's less problematic to be a consumer than to be like the media engine behind it. Like, I wouldn't make a true crime podcast. I do feel like that's like a different level of participation.
Yeah, no. We are interested in having a successful podcast. And I think I did bring up at one time, like, damn, like all of these articles I'm saying are like, if you want to be successful, make a true crime podcast. I'm like, should we do that? But no, we'll just go adjacent. We'll talk about true crime podcasts.
The SEO on this episode will draw those people in anyway.
This is 100% going to be our most listened to episode.
All right. Thanks, guys, for listening.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
If you enjoy the pod, we would love for you to give us a follow and rate us on Apple Podcasts, which helps us get the word out and reach new listeners. Full transcripts and show notes are available on Patreon, where if you choose to become a patron, you'll also get access to bonus content, our monthly book club, and our eternal gratitude.
If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a topic for a future episode, email us at everythingiknowaboutpod@gmail.com or DM us across all socials at EikaPod, that's EIKA pod. Thanks for listening and see you next week.